and welcome everybody. With great pleasure, I present to you the following session called Resources of Future Teachers to Promote Inclusion in Schools. And may I first briefly introduce myself. My name is Gonda Pickel. By training, I'm a special teacher and speech-language pedagogue and consulting teacher for children with physical and/or sensory impairments. And I've been in this job for many, many years. And currently, I'm a teacher and researcher at the University College of Teacher Education, Styria in Graz, in Austria. Graz is the capital of Styria. It's the southern federal state, for those of you who are not so familiar with our country. Parts of this session have already been presented in September 2019 at the ESA conference in Hamburg by my colleague Silvia Kopp-Sixt and by myself. So what you see and hear now will kind of overlap with the content we already presented in Hamburg, but I added some new research results because the research had been going on since then. So, resources of future teachers to promote inclusion in schools. This already implies that the research deals with the teacher training. What can we already do during teacher training to make students fit for their job in an inclusive environment? And first, I want to give you a short overview. First, you will hear a little theoretical framework for our research. First, it's Austria's response to the Convention of Rights for Persons with Disabilities. It was followed by a development of a new teacher education called Teacher Education New. It has competency models and key principles, which I'll show you a little later. And then we had the Profile for Inclusive Teachers, in short called TE4I, the UDO, the Theory of Universal Diverse Orientation, and the UDL, Principles of a Universal Design for Learning. And then we'll turn to our research projects, the Profile IP, in longer Profiling for Inclusion in Teacher Education. And then the second part of the research was a qualitative research. The first one was quantitative. Qualitative research interviews with lecturers and students, also carried on over the course of 2 years. The research team was under the head of Andrea Holzinger. She's also the head of our department, the Institute for Elementary and Primary Education at our Teacher University College, Styria. And the research team was made up by Gerda Kernbichler, Silvia Kopp-Sixt, Matthias Grammer, and myself. And for 1 year, our colleague Reinhard Schiesner was part of the team. He returned to his country, South Tyrol, later. So this was our team. And now to the first part of our theoretical framework. The TE41 stands for Fundamental Competencies for Teachers Fundamental Competencies for Teachers in Inclusive School Contexts. And it has 4 key principles. One is valuing learners' diversity. Heterogeneity among students, pupils, is seen as a resource and as an enrichment for education rather than an obstacle. And we need to be aware that our understanding of impairments does have an impact on policy and praxis. The second principle is supporting all learners. That is, teachers have high expectations in all learners, whether a pupil has got a disability or is just a pupil following a regular curriculum. The third principle is working with others, cooperating with others. That means as teachers in an inclusive environment, more than in any other environment, we have to be aware that we will be working in teams, be it with our small teams in our classroom or within the whole school. And the fourth and really important principle is continuing professional development. As teachers, we are responsible for our own continuous education, development. It's a lifelong learning. Especially we know that in education, in inclusion, research moves forward, knowledge moves forward. We have to keep up to date, so we are never done with our knowledge. And that's what we imply to our students early on. So this would be the TE4I, the competencies for teachers in inclusive school contexts. The second theoretical framework for our research is the Universal Diverse Orientation, in short UDO. This refers to a positive social attitude towards other people, which involves spontaneous appreciation of both similarities and differences that exist between different human beings. It's often an important aspect of well-being for persons who interact and communicate with others, because we do live in a diverse social world. And it's measured by the MGUDS scale, and it describes, for example, awareness and acceptance of both similarities and differences that exist among people. And it's got 3 subscales. One looks at the diversity of contacts. That is, students show or people in general, in our case students, show an interest in participating in diverse social and cultural activities. The second one is called Relativistic Appreciation, and by that is meant the extent to which students value the impact of diversity on self-conception or self-esteem and on personal growth. And the third one would be comfort with differences. And this one is the student's degree of comfort when they interact with heterogeneous individuals who may be, for what reasons ever, very different to themselves. So how comfortable do they feel in this environment? And the third theoretical framework is the UDL, Universal Design for Learning. This one originates in the USA. It followed the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act, a law that was the prerequisite to enable students, no matter how severely impaired they would be, to attend regular schools. And of course, being able to be educated in regular schools, pupils with disabilities need certain aids, prerequisites. They just need certain measurements being taken. So Rose and Mayer followed with the Universal Design for Learning, and it's actually it's a key element in inclusive education, and it postulates universal access to educational curricula for all pupils, including pupils with disabilities, but also, of course, pupils who are highly gifted. And within this design, therefore, special needs as well as competences of all students are taken into account. And according to the Universal Design for Learning, teaching starts with planning for all pupils. So you wouldn't start, okay, for this group of pupils, I plan this part, for this part, I plan this. No, you start thinking of all the pupils in your class, and then you start making the needed adjustments. And the adjustments may include alternative modes for communication. For example, if you have pupils who are not able to communicate verbally, you might have to supply this pupil with a means of augmentative and alternative communication, be it non-technical or technical. You might need special mode to access the computers, be it a switch or even eye gaze. So luckily we are in the situation that a motor disability rarely is a barrier to access information and communication technology, but we as teachers have to be aware what's out there on the market and what's available. And it may also imply reflecting on how to assess the individualized learning targets. If a child is not able to speak or has very different modes to show what he or she has learned, has remembered, we must find ways to find out which might be quite different from those to other pupils. And there are 3 key principles with the universal design for learning. The first one is providing multiple means of presentation. So you present your information in formats that can be accessed by all pupils. For example, we know that some types of special needs, for example, children who are in the autism spectrum disorder, typically, given they have visual competencies, it's far easier for them to process visually than just auditory, meaning that you would not provide information only auditory, but you would add the visual components to it and make it therefore so much easier for those students to follow. And on the other hand, when you have a child who is hard of hearing, you would know you would have to prevent lots of text, lots of pictures, in addition to all the other aids you can provide. The second one would be providing multiple means of action and expression. Children who express themselves differently or who learn differently then would also need different modes to express themselves. It could be an alternative communication mode. It could be an alternative body posture even that might look quite different from typical body postures, or different access to computers. And also the last key principle would be to provide multiple means of engagement. Sometimes children might have very special interests, and usually when we manage to find out where the special interests of those children lie, it's much easier for us to find out how we can tackle this child or trigger it to get more interested and just build our information around the special interest of this child. So the UDL was typically established to be used in schools. However, we were thinking that already in our tertiary education, when the students train to become teachers, we might try how can we imply the UDL even at the university level. And one point is to raise awareness. Students have to become aware that even at university level, one size does not fit all. Students learn, we have different modes of learning. Some need music while they learn, some need their quiet little corner. Then another aspect which is really important to me is already while they study, they should learn as much as possible on what's out on information and communication technology, on means of augmentative and alternative communication, in short AAC, in technology that enables even pupils with severe disability to access computers. So what we can do here in Graz is that I try to take students to a consultation firm where they really hands-on are able to try out those alternative modes to access computers, to communicate, to use communication aids. And we always find that this is a great means to break down barriers, because when they know, oh, it's not that difficult, and also when they know how those things can be bought, it's always a little obstacle, then they are much more eager to try it out with pupils in class later on. And most important, we do have students as well as lecturers who have disabilities themselves. We have students with visual impairments up to blindness. We have students with hearing impairments up to being deaf. We do have a blind co-lecturer. We have guest lecturers who are severely physically disabled. I could bring in a guest lecturer who is in a wheelchair and unable to speak verbally. So students could see how able and how competent these persons are and how well they manage their whole life despite their disabilities, and also which means of technology they use and are happy with it. And they can tell students firsthand what's useful, what's less useful. So this would be the universal design for learning, which has become a very important principle in general for us. And now to the research projects. And there are two different research fields. And an important distinction is the first research field is quantitative research. The second then would be qualitative research. The first one is called short Profile IP, longer Profiling for Inclusion in Teacher Education. The duration was 2017 to 2020. It was a long-term study. It was based on a mixed method approach and a multi-perspective data collection. And it asked for motivational aspects, relevant traits and interests of the pre-service teachers. And it compared students who chose to become experts in inclusive education to students who chose another focus. For example, nature and techniques, arts, media and digital competence, and there's others. And one focus then is inclusive education, where we wanted to find out the difference. And the second research field was then with qualitative research interviews with lecturers and students. So, for the research field, the teacher education knew, let me say a few words about it before that. In Austria, in 2013, the law for teacher education had changed. Before that, you could choose, did you want to become an elementary school teacher, a secondary school teacher, high school teacher, special teacher, vocational teacher. So you were very specialized starting from the beginning of your teacher training. With the new teacher education, you choose the age group you want to work with, either elementary, which would mean children aged, primary in this case, working with children aged 6 to 10, or with secondary grade students, typically working with children 10, 11 to 16, 17, but in case of children with disabilities, where sometimes the school career can be prolonged, even up to 19. So you just choose the age group and then you choose the different focus. And so this first quantitative research part aimed to find out, are there differences between students who chose the focus on inclusive education to become experts for inclusive education to students who chose another focus to the first subject. So it took into account the demographic data, personal experiences, future plans according to the teacher education. And in the first year, questions regarded life satisfaction, and it all used different scales. The portraits value questionnaire, business-focused inventory of personality, and test of general interest structures. And the year 2 had the UDO, the university scale for university diversity scale, and a COPE scale. And the research field 2 will then be another focus of this presentation, and I'll just turn to it later. So let's now look at the research field 1. First, the first question aimed to answer the key factors that influence the choice of the study focus. And looking specifically at students who chose the focus for inclusive education, we saw that there were some specific experiences that were influential, like personal or biographical data. Quite a few of our students who chose the focus on inclusive education do have a person with disability, among their relatives or in the family, or they know someone with a disability. So this would be personal, biographical. And then study related. Some feel it just goes well with the overall studies. And also previous occupational experiences, And for men, it's not untypical that instead of spending their month within the army, they might choose civil service and then work in an institution, maybe for elderly persons or for people with disabilities, and then think, okay, that might be an idea for me professional-wise. And then there's also individual beliefs regarding aspects of importance, influence on developments and future significance. Thinking that when you work in inclusive environments, you might be able to do something within society in general. And from the personality, it turns out that those students, they are quite ready to face challenges and they just experience joy in diverse activities. And then there's also a willingness to systematically promote pupils' learning development, even under more difficult circumstances maybe, and challenges, and individually taking into account individual needs. So students are eager to work in an individualized mode. When we look at the kinds of images of the vocational fields and future professional roles the students are developing, we see that they are expecting team teaching and cooperation. Also in the case of students for secondary education, transfer and connectivity to other subjects, and in general to school activities. So inclusion is not limited to the work with the children with special needs. And we thought that was a really nice outcome. And also students show almost a personal aim, a goal for being a representative for inclusive development and good practice. And they do have a commitment to broad concept of inclusion and confidence to manage a heterogeneous classroom. So these were the outcomes of the questionnaire after year 1. And then in the year 2, we had the universal diverse orientation, where I already told you a little bit about it. It's called a key factor for doing inclusion, because in an inclusive environment, you always have a heterogeneous environment. And when you are not comfortable within such an environment, you probably will have difficulties with the inclusion principles per se. So bringing competences for individualization as well as strategizing for managing heterogeneity in the classroom does need that comfort with differences. So the question was, do students who chose the inclusive education focus differ in their UDO profile in one way or other? Then, if you look at this scale, not really. So we see Primer IP is for primary students in primary education with the focus, and I'm not talking to the very left scale, with a focus on inclusive education, or primary with a different focus. And then secondary IP is students for secondary education with the focus on inclusive education versus secondary education with another focus. And if you look at the lines, there's not really much difference. Diversity of contact implies the interest in participating in diverse social and cultural activities. Then relativistic appreciation is the extent to which students value the impact of diversity on self-conception. And the sense of connection means the degree of comfort in interaction with heterogeneous individuals. So there's not really that the line moves up or down considerable. Even in the short form, we see that the average moves pretty close. So why? How can this be? We thought they would be so much different. Well, no, they are not. And there's possible reason for this. One is that probably today's students prove to be a rather homogeneous group of persons who can be described as average inclusive. Especially this might really have to do with the teacher education where when you choose to become a teacher, you cannot expect to work with a homogeneous group of pupils. Well, I wonder whether we ever could expect this, because which class would be homogeneous? Anyway, they know that they would be responsible for all students, with the teacher who became a specialist for inclusive education would be there for support. And then another possible cause is that the comfort for differences ranks highest, this factor. Every 10th student who was enrolled in this study had already attended an inclusive classroom, him or herself. Yeah, so they know what it is. They grew up with a very heterogeneous, with a group of peers. So this factor ranks really high, whereas interestingly, the factor sense of connectedness ranks lowest. Now, if you look back what this means, the interest in participating in diverse social, cultural activities with heterogeneous individuals. So this might be an impact for us to maybe create experiences, teaching scenarios where students gain greater interest in cultural, social events with heterogeneous others. Could be. Possible limits of this study is maybe we did not get more differences in the outcomes simply because when you are working with such a questionnaire, maybe you have the tendency you want to be appealing to others. So you sort of put down what's socially desirable. A possibility to get maybe more distinct results could be maybe after the end of the study period, before they enter in the real teaching life, to repeat this questionnaire, or even after the start of this teaching life. Would there be any differences compared to students who had chosen a different focus in the teacher education? So this was the research field 1, and now to research field 2. And this one was now the qualitative study. It was made up out of interviews with students and lecturers. How do we prepare teacher students to become impactful experts in inclusive education? So what we did was we did qualitative research interviews following the critical incident technique by Flanagan. What the qualitative research, a critical incidence technique does is it asks for aspects that are either seen very positive or as limiting, and you ask the interview partner to explicitly describe such a situation. So we had 8 different lecturers that were interviewed at over 2 years at the end of each semester. And we had the same qualitative research interviews following a different interview guide, of course, with primary students. In this case, the same students, because we kind of wanted to follow the possible change in their perspectives over the course of their teacher training. And different secondary students, again, over the 2 years, because we wanted to get students who have a different second subject. When students in secondary education choose inclusive education as their focus, they only need one other subject. Yeah? Whereas with a different focus, they might have English and geography or whatever, 2 subjects. But when one focus is inclusive education, because this already takes so many European credits, they only have to choose another subject, one other subject. So we wanted to get a variety of those students. And the interviews were digitally recorded, they were transcribed, and the transcribed data were then analyzed with the computer program MaxQDA with the version 11. So, to give you an overview of the interview guide, for example, we would ask how what do you see positive for the gain of competencies? And now to give you an example of what we would ask lecturers, if you think of your teaching in one of the classes, the courses for specialization or the focus on inclusive education, which situation within a class or a course could you think of where the students have learned really much or gave back to you as a feedback that they could gain a lot out of this session? Please describe this situation as distinct as possible. Which curricular structures are you seeing as supportive to teach as effective as possible? Please again describe it as good as you can. Please describe in a few sentences what exactly enhanced the learning process in the area of knowledge, and again in the area of action, and in the area of attitude. So we asked our interview partners to really describe these situations where they had the feeling this situation added positively to competence gain in the students. And then we also asked for the negative parts, with the same type of questions, but now asking for, please describe a situation where you had the feeling that the students really couldn't gain much out of the session. Or what are the curricular aspects that are limiting your possibilities to really share your information in a most effective way? And we asked our teacher colleagues, the lecturer colleagues, to again describe these situations as closely and as explicit as possible. The same was done with students, of course, not from the situation as a lecturer, but from a students. They were asked to describe situations where they could gain really a lot in the competencies regarding knowledge, regarding action, and regarding attitudes. And this was verbatim transcribed, and from the data we got, when we analyzed the data, we got the following categories, and I'm now just reading them to you. Really important were issues regarding the curriculum, issues regarding didactics in tertiary education, issues regarding teaching practice, issues regarding study organization, issues regarding interaction, both between lecturers and between teacher-students, issues regarding related courses, issues regarding assignments and assessment, issues regarding equipment, and issues regarding the choice of the study focus. And for now, I'm only going to focus on the first four. These were the categories that were richest with data. So they might have the most impact on the outcomes of this study. So starting with the curriculum-related issues, and I'm now following the same mode. First, I will always give you the perspective of lecturers in primary education, followed by the perspective of lecturers in secondary education. Then again, the same category, perspective of students in primary education, perspective of students in secondary education. So for the curriculum-related issues, when we ask lecturers in primary education, really all said that the new curriculum in the teacher education, new starting 2013, actually allows a much deeper focus on the area of special education per se, disabilities to become more specific than the former curriculum for special education, where teachers were trained as special teachers, but we didn't have the same amount of classes to really provide in-depth knowledge on certain areas of support. And there was one critics too that lecturers said some subjects would even require a higher number of teaching hours. For action, lecturers really are happy about the freedom and the flexibility in the curriculum that allows also sharing personal experiences. Many lecturers, like myself, have been in classes themselves, like I myself have been in special classes and in inclusive classes. And students really do appreciate when you can link theoretical input to maybe practical experience you had themselves. And then lecturers regret that, for example, excursions to companies where people with disability are employed, or companies who provide service to people with disabilities are not explicitly stated, scheduled in the curriculum. So it's always a question how your class, your course is scheduled. Are you able to go to such an excursion? Because if a class takes place in the evening, is scheduled for the evening, you have little chance to do it. And then for attitude, the lecturers report that with the increase of knowledge and also when students have a chance to make self-awareness exercises, how is it to not see when you are blindfolded? How do you manage to get around when you're in a wheelchair, for example? Yeah? This may really lead to a change in attitudes. The other part is what lecturers see as a bit of a problem is that investigating literature is not explicitly positioned in the curriculum. And some of our students still come with sort of a school-like behavior. That is, they are not yet in the university mode, ready to research literature on their own. So they do what they have to do, but this student attitude, I just go to the library and research what's out there, this really needs some work to be done yet. For the lecturers in secondary education, they say that, and this has to do with a change in the curriculum. First, for students in secondary education, they had their support areas, for example, support in speech language, support in the cognitive area, support in the visual area, support in the auditory area, in the 6th semester. And this was moved to the 2nd semester, and this really is a great advantage now. And also it enables them to orientate towards what will be my focus later on. Yeah, where will I want to gain in-depth knowledge? They criticize a little bit the need to bridge the gap between educational sciences and the inclusive subjects. Regarding action, there's no difference to the lecturers in primary education. They do really appreciate the flexibility and the freedom in the curriculum. But then they mention that subjects that deal with the technical methodology that is relevant for the teaching practice out in schools should be taught previous instead of simultaneously to the teaching practice in schools. What we found out by the interviews is, and this goes a little bit with the UDO, that the choice to specialize in inclusive education is independent of the second subject. So the students' second subjects in secondary education might be math or physical education or German or philosophy or religion or whatever. Yes, totally independent. It's not specifically linked to certain types of subjects. Then when we ask the students really appreciate the possibility to gain a profound knowledge in the areas of disabilities. And this also includes the special terminology, or in medical areas, in the pedagogical area. But they do criticize possible duplications of contents that may happen when courses are taught by different teachers who didn't have the chance, for example, to really figure out what will I bring in my class, what are you going to teach in your class. We try to avoid it though. Then regarding the area of action, students really appreciate when theory and praxis are closely linked together, when you bring in concrete materials for either promoting learning, assessing. The more concrete, the more it's appreciated. What's less appreciated is courses that focus either only on transmitting theoretical knowledge or on sensitization, like when students just have to do self-awareness exercises without being backed up with the necessary theoretical background. Regarding the attitude, when students can have hands-on experiences, direct interaction with persons with disabilities, this may really lead to a change in their attitudes, what they think those people are capable of doing. For example, as I already mentioned, when we do have guest lecturers with disabilities, or when we are able to make excursions to sites where they meet people with disabilities and fulfill their job very competently. And the students in secondary education, they repeat what the lecturers, they appreciate the move from the support areas from the 6th to the 2nd semesters, but also that the teaching practice in schools starts in the 2nd semester. So early on they have a chance to see, is this what I really want to do? Is this what I expect a classroom would be like? On the other hand, it may happen that during the teaching practice, students might never meet pupils with a type of disability they learned about in a course. For example, they might learn about the special requirements for students with autism spectrum disorder, might never see a child with autism spectrum disorder in a classroom, or profound cognitive impairment, or severe physical impairment. So the ideal connection would be getting the theoretical background and at the same time meeting children who are living with this type of disability themselves. What students say is that in-depth discussion about requirements for certain pupils or reflecting after their teaching training really leads to a change in their attitudes. Also towards inclusive education per se, not only towards people with disabilities. They see what's possible in inclusive education. For secondary education in Austria, in our federal state here, Styria, inclusive education had started in primary schools in the mid-1980s and was only later followed by inclusion in secondary schools. So maybe not all the students in secondary education had seen that inclusion also works in secondary education. They might have seen inclusion in their own schooling during primary school, but not so much in secondary school. The next issues would be related to didactics in tertiary education. And again, when we look at the perspective of the lecturers in primary education first, lecturers say that it's best when they have the chance to teach consecutive courses themselves. So you know exactly what have I done in the previous course, on what knowledge can I build on, what will follow in the next course. And when you do not have the chance to link theoretical input to a practical experience the students can make, this is sort of a barrier to the knowledge really sticking to the student. It's empty. Well, empty is a bad word for it, but it's different when you really can link a theoretical background knowledge to a practical experience. And regarding actions, lecturers say that it's so important to really model situations, to create case examples, to show case examples via video, to do role play, to present materials, to not just lecture, but to really go into actions. And then, of course, you have lectures, which, unlike seminars or pro-seminars, are not meant to allow much interaction. They are not set up like this. Then, of course, those hardly contribute to action competence. And this also implies to a change in attitudes. The more hands-on experiences students can make, the more self-competence they get. Yeah, for example, in dealing with technical aids, with communication aids, with whatsoever, they need to do it and have the chance to try it out, and then they gain the self-competence and the self-esteem growth. There's one issue, we didn't find it much, but it could happen that the inclusive education might not be the first choice for a student in his or her studies, and then such a student might have the necessary motivation to really immerse in the field. But then again, they have the chance to switch. So typically, this was more a concern of lecturers, but we did not find it in the interviews with the students. None of the interviewed students had said, or even what he or she knew from other peer students, that the focus had been only second choice. So lecturers in secondary education, they pretty much said the same. Knowledge becomes usable when it's linked to reality and action. And also they observe that students hesitate to deal with theoretical contents when those contents cannot be transferred directly into action. Some lecturers says that they, as assignments, they ask students to keep learning diaries, for example, to really reflect on the gain of competencies, what's a challenge in my gain of competencies, what fosters my gain in competencies. And they think it prepares them better for teaching reality than just giving out reading assignments, for example. And the narrower the focus of a course or a subject or content is, the more it limits the width of experimental thinking. The more discursive you deal with subjects, the more this facilitates openness in students. So here we have again a possibility to change attitudes. Unfortunately, I have to say very few lecturers have no personal experience in inclusive education and therefore have concerns. Does it work? Can it work? And when those lecturers pass their concerns on to students, this might really have an impact that students question the possibility to make it happen, to make it work before they even try. Then when we look at students for what they say about didactic-related issues, they really profit from a lecturer's broad knowledge. They said in the interviews, yeah, you really see he or she has been in the field for many years, he or she knows what he or she is talking about. And they repeat pretty much what the lecturers are saying. Theoretical input which is not linked to practical implementation or case example remains empty knowledge. Students again appreciate the direct contact with persons with disabilities. These can be teachers or pupils in their class or peer students. I was already mentioning exercises to increase awareness. What does it mean to live with abilities? Now, there are some disabilities that you can fake. For example, you can ask students to sit blindfolded for an hour or so and see how differently you now experience your environment. But you cannot fake, for example, missing an extremity. You cannot fake being in an autism spectrum disorder. So the students differentiate very clearly when is an awareness exercise actually useful for me, or when is it just done to be done, but doesn't gain much. Yeah? Regarding attitudes, again, it's this personally meeting individuals with disabilities that chooses attitudes and makes students aware of the maybe previously unexpected competencies in people with disabilities. And we already said that impairment being fake does not contribute to a change in attitudes. And perspectives of students in secondary education, again, the richer the contents of a lecturer's personal input are, the more they gain out of it. And if a lecture is just declaimed rather monotonous, where they have the feeling, okay, this person really hasn't been in a situation, him or herself, they gain less knowledge. Again, we are at the importance with teachers with disabilities regarding action. They really add to authenticity and can tell students firsthand, what did I need in my own school time? What helped me to make my career? What would I have needed? Were I now a child with my same disability? What could have changed it for the better? Yeah? How has society changed in between? And then, of course, students refer to their assignments, and they pretty much, interestingly, say the same as lecturers. They say assignments that are just based on reading, they gain less out of them than assignments that allow room for some creativity, or like learning diaries, where they really can show their personal growth of competence. A lecturer's openness and enthusiasm, yeah, for if you like what you teach, what you are doing, this really positively influences the students' attitudes. And also they experience the joy of the pupils in the class where they do the teacher practice. And this really is a joy for themselves. Yeah, they come in the class as young persons. The children come all overjoyed by these young new teachers. That's the best feedback for our teacher students. On the other hand, in secondary education, students who did not have the experience of inclusive education in their all school time and who chose a different focus other than inclusive education and are team teaching in the teacher practice with the students, they might show skepticism at first. Does inclusion really work? So they are also faced with this having to convince status even. The second part we are looking at is a very important one, the teaching practice in schools. When we're looking at lecturers' opinions first, for them the optimum is when they teach about a child, about certain disabilities in a course, in a support area, and students have then the chance to meet such a child in class. This is the optimum prerequisite for wanting them to further dig into this area, further investigate. On the other hand, in the first semester and also only a little bit in the second semester, they do not really have the chance to often see students in class. So this limits the linking of theoretical input to practical experiences. Regarding action, when students have teacher training in classes, they really appreciate an accompanying course that allows coaching by a person other than the mentor, where they can openly talk about possible problems, challenges in the classroom, and are just accompanied and have a field to openly talk about the teaching practice. And then again, the critical remark, when we have classes for teacher training, where, for example, children only show mild learning impairments, students then do not have a chance to apply their knowledge they gained in a course in their practical teaching. And regarding attitudes, what we found, teacher students, they might not have yet have all the tools they need as like an experienced teacher has, But they really display joy in working with the children. They are eager to go in the class. You feel when they talk about their teaching experience, how much they just like it. In schools, they might meet other teachers who still use segregating terminology. They are rare, but they are still out there. And they may have an impact on the students' approach to inclusive education. And the more important is an accompanying coaching course where the students have a chance to reflect on those possible utterances they might hear or attitudes they might see. Lecturers in secondary education, what they say regarding teaching practice in schools, again, they appreciate the thoughtful coaching and the mentoring that might also lead to increased self-confidence. Students at our university college have to put much workload in their planning because they have to learn what do I need in planning a lesson. So of course it has to be very explicit, but they only value its worth of it when it's modeled also by their mentors, when the mentor shows them, listen, it's important to plan for a lesson. That's why I do it. Maybe I show you how I plan, but it's important that I think about individualization, differentiation. Where do I get my background knowledge from? What would I do in case I would suddenly be unable to come? Would a teacher colleague be able to follow my lesson plan? So their planning needs to be appreciated. They need to get feedback to really realize the value of their efforts they put into planning. And of course, the best benefit of teaching practice is it gives them the chance to directly interact with pupils and also to see their development. There may be small, tiny steps, but they see what they can add to the development of a certain pupil. And also in secondary education, where students are used to bigger progresses when we are talking about pupils who are in the regular curriculum, when they learn to appreciate even small, tiny steps in pupils who live with a disability, this really leads to a change in the attitude. That's like, it's not just a big success, that's a success. So it can be a tiny step, maybe an even bigger success. So, and when it comes to the students, of course, they gain a lot of insight when they have the chance to interact with the inclusive education specialist in a class, when they are shown how to assess, how to observe a child, how to write individual education plans, and even how to interact with parents, given the parents allow a student being present. And the students would wish for more time in class, especially for the teacher training in inclusive education, where they have the chance to focus on children with some types of disabilities. The more chances students get to apply strategies for individualization and differentiation, the more the competencies increase. And again, students who never had the chance to work with children with certain disabilities then lack the competence in planning for and working with such a child. Regarding the attitude, there happens a lot in the teacher training. You know, we all live with possible biases, and of course, students enter a classroom with biases. Okay, this child comes from this or that social background. They have heard about children with certain syndrome, might have this or that challenge, and then they come into class and see, hey, it's not like that at all. It might be completely different. Yes, so teaching practice is maybe the biggest chance to lessen to minor biases that possibly are pre-existing. Students also say what they would appreciate is at the beginning of their studies to become teachers to visit a variety of schools, to get an impression, to see the difference of what's out there, and to really gain a deeper understanding of the future profession. And when we look at students in secondary education, they appreciate that dealing with the curricula and the context of the subjects they learn, they study in real school life. And something we could already change. At first, they were teams, a student with the focus on inclusive education and a student in another subject. And now the student with the focus on inclusive education is not, does not do his or her teacher training in teams, but only, like in reality, would work together with the classroom teacher. Then regarding action, reflecting didactical activities facilitates, of course, the planning of further activities. But interestingly, in secondary education, where students also study as second subjects, they report what they learn about individualization and differentiation can be perfectly transferred into their second subjects. So actually, they say, by the focus on inclusive education, they gain in their teaching abilities overall. Yeah? And sometimes, of course, especially for young teachers or even teacher students, they say, I don't feel quite prepared yet to meet all the challenges that they might see in a certain classroom. And again, when it comes to attitudes for students, teaching practice allows the interpersonal interactions, and then when they feel it goes well, they are appreciated by the pupils in their class. Their chosen focus is just confirmed, and they say, it's the right thing I've chosen. It's good that I chose that focus. On the other hand, especially in secondary schools, when students may witness divergent didactical opinions of subject teachers and inclusion specialist teachers in a classroom, and this might lead that they observe those divergent opinions might lead to segregation, either within the classroom, this group sits there, this group sits over there, or even outside the classroom. I don't want to say you never should separate students. No, yeah, this, of course, having separate rooms is the best ever. Maybe every child wants to go out and learn individually at times. It becomes problematic when always the same group of children are isolated, in my mind. Regarding the study organization, we organized it a little bit different in positive and negative aspects. Positive would be when we look at lecturers in primary education, that lecturers with extensive experience in the field and in some courses, team teaching between lecturers facilitates deeper insight into subjects. And when lecturers might have teacher students in classes that are already working out in the field, some maybe quite a few years, but as part of their in-service training or within a master program, they come back to the university. And they really typically are an enrichment. And the other students, the peer students, learn, okay, I can actually apply this knowledge. Here it is where it comes into action and it's useful in practice. Negative point is that some of our seminars and pro-seminars are organized in very large chunks, up to 5 or 8 units. Now for a seminar you need 75 presence time. When a student happens to be sick at one of such a long blocked unit, he or she might have a problem. So it's questionable, should we stick to those long blocks on seminars? On one hand, they are great for making possible excursions, for really go in depth in a subject, but it becomes problematic when someone has problems attending for some reason or the other. And then we had something that had to do with the curriculum, and that might be a direct outcome of this study, that some courses are relevant for all students, no matter which focus they chose. And some choose the same subject but more in depth. So it might happen that students who chose the focus of inclusive education in the second semester, where they get all the support areas, they really hear in depth, for example, how to support communication, how to support cognitive functioning. And then in the fourth semester, they get what all the students get. So this has a direct influence on what we have to do to adjust the curriculum. Perspective of lecturers in the secondary education. Again, they appreciate the chance to both accompany a teaching practice in a coaching course and teach the course that provides the theoretical framework to the teaching practice. That's something that's distinct for secondary education. And then that has to do with our place. Sometimes seminar rooms are just too small to allow, for example, for really doing it action cooperative learning modes, working with materials in the way you'd like. So this is just outside challenges. And then also how courses are challenged, especially in secondary education, to get the necessary presence time. Students sometimes are forced to either leave earlier or come a little bit later into a course, just by the way these courses are scheduled, because they move between the university and the teacher university college. Study organization from the perspective of students in primary education. Again, I don't want to repeat this. Students so much appreciate co-teaching of lecturers who have disabilities themselves. And the more excursions to places where the contents are taught in the class are seen as enrichment. And of course, being a student, when you have a full day that are just consisting of long blocks, you have too little time to regenerate in between. That's very difficult from you as a student and as a lecturer, by the way. And then students also report in lectures where they get such a high amount of theoretical input, but still lack the practical experience, they face a mental overload. And students in secondary education, they again appreciate the excursions to institutions where people with disabilities are employed. They even call it as a highlight. They lead to increased reflection on competencies of individuals. And they do appreciate teaching practice in various secondary school forms. How does inclusion work in those various secondary school types? And also to interact with pupils with different types of disabilities. And what was already an outcome before, the course that focuses on lesson planning, like all those technical, didactical contents should be taught before instead of simultaneously the teaching studies take place. So, we are already at the implications of this study. So, the focus on inclusive education clearly facilitates the acquisition of competencies in the areas of knowledge, action, and attitudes regarding teaching children with disabilities in inclusive settings. The increase of competencies in these areas can be regarded as additional value also in other areas and settings, what secondary students reported, for example, in the other subject. Working with concrete case examples allows the modeling of action possibilities. Teachers as well as students with disabilities are important role models and a signal for inclusive tertiary institution of education. When we train students to become models for inclusive education, we kind of need to show that inclusion is possible also in tertiary education. And the amount of teaching practice in inclusive education allowing teaching experiences with children with disabilities clearly needs to be expanded. And then the last outcome regarding the didactics, depending on contents, the amount of courses taught in long but only few blocks is questionable, because it might be a real barrier to some students to get the necessary presence time. And of course, there's limits to the study because the results only reflect the perspective of a limited number of lecturers and students for primary and for secondary education at one university college for teacher education, ours here in Styria. The data were collected 4 times at the end of each semester over a period of 2 years. And then Eisner, he suggested the triangulation among the researchers. We have that. We were quite a team. So our triangulation guarantees the validity of the results, but the reliability could be increased by conducting a long-term study or a replica of the study in following study years. So that would be a possibility for increased reliability. For the references, I already sent out an extended literature list, so you should get access to this one. And then I just thank you for your attention, and you also see where you can contact me. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.